Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm talking to you from Tel Aviv, Israel, here at the Institute for National Security Studies. My name is Dan Shapiro. I'm the former U.S. Ambassador to Israel and currently a Distinguished Visiting Fellow here at INSS. We're very pleased today to join with our colleagues at Cornell University's Institute for Politics and Global Affairs, under the leadership of former Congressman Steve Israel, to present a timely and incisive panel on the election campaign in the United States and some of its implications for foreign policy issues of interest to Israel. INSS is an independent institute that focuses on strategic, innovative, policy-oriented research, which it publishes and provides in briefings to the Israeli government and officials from other governments. Its areas of research focus primarily on the Middle East, on Israel's neighbors, but also include work done on Europe, Russia, China, and of course the United States. It goes without saying that a keen area and interest and focus of research is on U.S. foreign policy, which is so important to Israelis as they make their own policies, and the context in which those policies are made of U.S. politics, which is why this panel is so relevant to our researchers and our broader audience. With that, I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, Steve Israel, to introduce the program and the panel.
Ambassador, thank you so much. Thank you for your service to the United States of America and so ably representing us in Israel. Thank you to General Yadlin for his leadership. Dr. Shira Efron, thank you for your participation. And to my friends and colleague, Congressman Tom Davis and David Axelrod, thank you for participating. Before we begin, let me just acknowledge some special folks who are with us. We're joined in the audience today by former United States Senator Mark Kirk, a Republican from Illinois, former Congressman Marty Frost, a Democrat from Texas, former Congressman Bill Enyart, a Democrat from Illinois, and Fred Zeidman, who chaired the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, was appointed chair under President George W. Bush and currently leads the Council for Secure America. Thank you to all. I served in Congress for 16 years. 6 of those years were spent as a member of the senior Democratic leadership. I chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Tom Davis chaired the National Republican Campaign Committee. I was also on the Armed Services Committee and the Appropriations Defense Subcommittee, and here's a vital lesson that I learned on those committees. Members of Congress tend to pay special attention to issues when the military gives those issues an acronym. And several years ago, the U.S. Army War College in Pennsylvania developed an acronym that I believe perfectly describes the 2020 presidential election, the 2016 presidential election, the state of our politics in the US, the state of Israeli politics, the state of the world. And that acronym is VUCA, V-U-C-A, volatile, complex, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. If those words don't aptly describe our politics today throughout the world, I don't know what does. The Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University has one mission, and that is to break through the VUCA. We curate programs designed to deepen discourse and raise understanding. And today, we try and work our way through this VUCA environment with the presidential election with a truly expert panel. I'd like to introduce them now, and then we're going to get right into 2 blocks of questions. I'll be questioning our panelists specifically on what's happening, the state of play inside the U.S. presidential election. And then Ambassador Shapiro will take us through a orientation on foreign policy and national security for both the United States and Israel. David Axelrod is the preeminent American political strategist and commentator. He was the former chief strategist to President Barack Obama and senior advisor. He is the founding director of the University of Chicago's Nonpartisan Institute of Politics, senior political commentator for CNN. He hosts the Axe Files, a top-rated podcast featuring in-depth conversations with public figures across the political spectrum. And he is the author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, Believer, My 40 Years in Politics. Former Congressman Tom Davis served 14 years in the House of Representatives, representing Virginia. He chaired the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform from 2003 to 2007. He chaired, as I said, the National Republican Congressional Committee from 1999 to 2002. He's a Washington, D.C. attorney who focuses his practice on handling a variety of congressional and regulatory affairs. And his comments, his insight appear regularly in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, The Hill, Meet the Press, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, and he's appeared on the Bill Maher Show. Shira Efron, a policy advisor at the Israel Policy Forum, visiting fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies. Her research focuses on U.S. policy towards the Middle East, including Israel's evolving ties with China and the Israel-Arab conflict. She specializes in policy analysis, research, and planning methods that can be applied to a variety of contexts. So Congressman Davis and David Axelrod, let's start with the question that everybody wants answered at the very top of this program, which is, who is the probable winner of the presidential election in November? David Axelrod, let's start with you.
First of all, Steve, let me say it's an honor to be with all of you and with some old friends. You guys were great fellows at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. And I will say, since you did not mention Rahm Emanuel as someone who was listening to this event, there's never been two smarter guys who've headed the congressional campaign committees than you guys. Look, I mean, I'd say two things. One is that anybody in the predictions business is crazy, given the volatility that you mentioned in politics. 4 months ago, the question I was being asked was, Trump is through the impeachment, his numbers are improving, the economy is strong, can he be beaten? 4 months later, he looks to be in deep, deep trouble. And we're 4 months closer to the election. I think that Joe Biden's going to win this election. And there are a whole bunch of reasons in the data that would suggest that. First of all, Donald Trump is trailing, and by more than a few on the average, in a lot of the states that he won last time narrowly in order to capture the presidency under our electoral system. That should be of deep concern to him. His approval rating is hovering in the high 30s or 40 in the territory that George H.W. Bush was in, Jimmy Carter was in, the two last presidents who lost re-election. He is losing four groups that he carried last time. Senior people over 65 should be a big concern to him. College-educated white voters, suburban voters by a massive margin. He won them last time. He's behind by more than 20 points there. And I think that's the sort of seismic shift in American politics. And then independent voters, he won last time, and he's losing by a significant margin this time, although there's a large undecided there. All of these things point to Biden winning in the fall. And the last one is an intangible, which is his handling of the COVID-19 crisis, his handling of the racial strife that has risen up after the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis, has been a low-rated affair by American voters, both in the low 30s. It's dragged him down. And a lot of the mystique of Trump, it used to be that people say, well, I don't like his tweets, I don't like his behavior, but he's strong, he's effective, and the economy is good. Now the economy is not good. He's not looking strong. He's not looking particularly competent. So at this juncture, I would say that Joe Biden is the favorite to win the election in the fall.
Congressman Davis?
Well, I think if the election were today, there's no question Joe Biden would win the race. But if you'd gone back 4 years at this time, I think Hillary Clinton would have won the race. And as you said, there are just a lot of volatility. We've been through impeachment, then we went through the COVID virus. We've been through George Floyd and the ensuing protests and riots, and now we're in a recession, and we don't know what the issue is going to be 4 or 5 months. That's an eternity in politics, and a lot of things can happen. And although Trump is very undisciplined, which is I think his undoing, I never underestimate his ability to take an issue and ride it and polarize it until the end. I think all the major indicia right now is that Americans have had 4 years of Donald Trump. He was the change agent 4 years ago. Now he's an incumbent. People have seen how he's dealt with crisis. And I think he's actually bungled his opportunities to try to bring the country together. But he has a very strong base that won't quit on him. A number of variables. Number one, what if the colleges, many of them don't open this year? Democratic strength is in college towns, where colleges, you can go through these dormitories, register people, get them to vote en masse. If they aren't there, that could affect turnout. We saw in this recent special election in California that mail-in ballots didn't hurt Republicans because the Democrats were unable to harvest them. So I think turnout is an issue. We see that Trump's voters are more enthusiastic about him than Biden's are. Biden's voters are basically anti-Trump voters. If this continues to be a referendum on Donald Trump, he's going to lose. Joe Biden has been moving ahead because he's been able to stay in the basement and stay relatively disciplined. We don't know how he'll perform when he has to go out there. We've seen him kind of go off script a few times. But the major indicia right now, being in a recession, seeing the response to coronavirus, all of these issues work against Trump today. We just don't know what black swans are out there in the coming 3 or 4 months. And you just never underestimate Trump's ability to seize on an issue at the right time and get disciplined at just the right time to bring this off. And I just finally add, this is still a very polarized country culturally. And we've seen with the George Floyd protests and in some riots in some places, the way elements have handled this. This puts attention on suburban voters where Trump has seen a huge leakage in his base. Biden yesterday talked about having to raise taxes. There are still some opportunities out there for Trump if he can get disciplined and seeing what happens. So it's not over. But I would agree with David. If the election were today and looking at what we know today, it looks like Biden is on a path for victory. And for Republicans, the warning shot is if Biden wins, I think Democrats are likely to take back the Senate. A victory for Biden without having control of the Senate puts, I think, a very difficult governance coalition together.
David mentioned some data.
Steve, can I just make one comment? I agree with everything that Tom said. Can I make just one point? This is the number that I think would be most concerning to if I were in Trump's camp. Their strategy has to be to bring Biden down and make him as unacceptable as Trump, and that's that's the way he beat Hillary Clinton. He was, he was unpopular. She was unpopular. Both of them less favorable than favorable. But he overwhelmingly won the group of voters who didn't like either of them. In the polling that has come out recently, Biden has a 40-point lead among voters who give both candidates a negative rating. That would be a real concern to me if I were over there in the Trump camp. So, I agree with Tom. I mean, like I said at the outset, anybody's in the prediction business in this environment is crazy. And there's one thing I would say about Trump that Tom did not, which is he has proven himself willing to do or say just about anything to win. And that makes this kind of asymmetric political warfare if you're fighting Donald Trump. And I would be concerned about that if I were Joe Biden.
I've heard you say, David, on CNN several times that President Trump has feral instincts, and no matter where he may be in the polls in October, those feral instincts are not to be underestimated. Yes. No,
that's right. Look, and Tom said it. He knows how to cut cultural issues. The problem right now is the moment calls for something different. And Trump, he thinks of, and he has a theory of the case. And that theory is the country is evenly divided. And certainly in those states that he has to carry, which are disproportionately older and whiter, that if he just rallies his base and he just gets his base out, that he can win those states. And so he is a base-only politician. And right now, whether it's COVID or certainly on the race issue, the country is not looking for that. I think there are people who are not racists, but are sort of indifferent on the issue of race, and they were uncomfortable with Trump's white identity politics in the past. But now it looks costly, because he's throwing gasoline on the fire when people want him to be dousing the fire. And his instinct is always going to be to throw gasoline on the fire. So, that is he has a theory of the case. I think he's shrinking. His base is firm, but he has a very high floor, but he has a low ceiling, and he's lowering that ceiling to the point where he may not be able to pull this off.
Steve, let me just tack on to that. I think Trump's biggest problem is again, he carried last time voters who didn't like either candidate 70-30. He's losing them worse than that this time because now he's the incumbent, and it's, he's a known quantity. And I think the biggest problem for him is, do Americans want to have him in their living room over the next 4 years? I think they are tired of turmoil at this point and are looking for stability and some unity. The question mark out there is, how is Biden going to respond once he gets out there? In my opinion, Joe Biden is a thoroughly decent man, but he leaves an impression he's just not on top of his game at this point. And once he gets out there, how does he respond to that? How does Trump take advantage of that? But my opinion is Trump can't win this by just demonizing Biden. He's got to somehow make himself more likable. And to date, he has not shown those instincts.
So let's do this in the interest of time, because I want to, within 5 or 6 minutes, shift over to Ambassador Shapiro to discuss foreign policy and national security. I want to show 3 charts, and I want you to help our audience understand what's behind those charts. I want to dig into the charts. The first is a 538.com aggregate of President Trump's approval-disapproval rating. And so as of just a few days ago, his approval was 40.4%, his disapproval 6.1%. The second chart, if we can get that up, I was going to do these individually, but in the interest of time, I'd like to consolidate it. This is the head-to-head. This is where we stood on June 29th. This is, again, 538.com. President Trump, 41.5% of the vote. Vice President Biden, 50.8%. And the third chart, which I think is one of the most important, is a side-by-side of the battleground states. For those of our friends in Israel, I want to remind you that this is not a national election. This is an election in 7 or 8, perhaps 9 critical battleground states in the Electoral College that could swing either way. And so if you take a look at where Donald Trump was in Arizona, he was in 2016, he was up 4. Now, I can't, unfortunately, for some reason, I can't see the 2020 results, but I'm sure you all can see much closer. Florida up 3 in 2016. Georgia, he was up 2 in 2016. Michigan and North Carolina, Hillary Clinton was up in 2016. Pennsylvania, President Trump was up by 2. Wisconsin, Clinton was up by 5. And so let's start with Tom, Congressman Davis. What do you make of these data points? And if you could spend some time helping us to analyze what is happening in those battleground states. Why is Joe Biden at this point doing as well as he's doing in those swing states? We'll start with Congressman Davis, and then we'll go to David Axelrod.
Yeah, I think it has very little to do with Joe Biden. It has a lot to do with Donald Trump, and he's on a downward course. As David mentioned earlier, if you go back 4 months, the economy was on a roll. We had the lowest unemployment in 50 years. All of a sudden, the COVID virus hits. This has not been handled, I think, as you look at this. He didn't take advantage of his leadership role on this. Deaths are up. The economy has now cratered around him, and he's come off a series of unfortunate tweets and the way he has handled this. So I think you think maybe he's at a low point. He's had a confluence of things that have driven this down over time. The question is, American memories can be relatively short, and and he's got a chance to rebound from this. But today you're taking him at the lowest point I think he's probably had in his presidency, with the economy collapsing and the like. We'll see if he can recover from this, but they're going to have to do something different. The other thing I just add, and I said this before, he's an incumbent now. He can't. It's no longer promise. It's no longer I'm going to hire the best people. I'm going to make things better. People have had 3.5 years to see what they're getting out of this, and given some of these are influences outside anything he could have done, but what he campaigned on originally, and those dynamics are now gone. His one hope, as I look at this, is when it comes to economic recovery. if they can show recovery and he can draw lines between himself and Joe Biden at the end, the public may opt for policy over personality. But at this point, Trump's personality seems to be kind of the galvanizing force and divisive force in this, and that's working against him.
David Axelrod, final word before we go to Ambassador Shapiro.
Yeah, well, I agree with Tom that the comparison from 4 years ago is only slightly useful because Trump is the incumbent now. And I think, generally in American politics, Ronald Reagan made the question famous, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? I think the question that everybody is pondering now in America is, can we really do this for 4 more years? Can we wake up to these tweets and these tantrums and and the chaos that seems to follow Trump around? And these crises have really brought those to the fore, and his reaction to them has accentuated that. And the question is, does he double down on his personality traits, or can he pull back from them? I don't think he can. In terms of your chart and the battleground states, I mean, I think that the biggest shift that has imperiled him is this suburban shift, and that has to be deeply worrisome. Also, even among those groups that are core groups of his, take non-college educated white women. He carried them by 27 points in 2016. He's winning them now, but only by 11 points. Even evangelical voters who voted for him 81-16 in 2016 now favor him by a huge margin, but it's more like 66-25. And this is the last point I want to make. Donald Trump bought himself an impeachment trying to stop Joe Biden from becoming the Democratic nominee with all of Biden's frailties and all of his liabilities. Why? Because Biden was culturally inconvenient for Trump. He is an old, white, Irish Catholic, working class guy, and he is not scary to the people who Trump needs to scare. And now you see Trump, rather than saying that Biden is radical left, he acknowledges, well, he's not radical left, but he's just so addled that the radical left will take over if he is president. And that's kind of a bank shot. And he's also set the bar very low for Biden. We didn't mention debates. There'll be debates. Trump will look to try and expose Biden in these debates as ill-equipped, but he is, in most campaigns, you try and lower the bar for yourselves going into debates. Trump is doing it for Biden. If Biden shows up and is reasonably good, he's going to get a bigger bounce out of that than he normally would. So again, I agree with Tom. Anything can happen. We've seen things happen we never could have foreseen. That's the way presidential politics is. But the one thing that hasn't changed is Donald Trump's basic instincts and personality. I don't think that's going to change. And I think Americans are rendering a verdict on that.
Steve, just quickly, it's one thing to be an outside candidate, and Donald Trump was a great outside candidate. He's not a good inside incumbent candidate. I think that's the real difference here. People have seen him.
Yeah, and I know we've got time issues here, and I don't want, Dan Shapiro's a dear friend of mine. I don't want to cut into his time. But on this outsider insider thing, the peculiar thing about this COVID-19 crisis here is that Donald Trump is leading the government that's supposed to be responding to the crisis. At the same time, he's trying to lead the resistance to the guidance that his public health people are issuing to Americans, and the tension has really hurt him, I think.
Well, thank you both for your insight on the state of play in the election. I'd like to turn it over to Ambassador Shapiro to take us through a broader conversation on foreign policy, national security, and then we'll reserve the last 10 to 12 minutes for audience Q&A. Ambassador, we'll throw it over to you.
Thanks, Congressman Israel. So I will come back to David and Congressman Davis in just a moment, because I think a lot of our Israeli audience will be interested in the degree to which foreign policy issues are even being debated in this election. You all mentioned the economy and the COVID crisis and the racial justice issues, and of course so much about Trump's personality, but I don't think either of you has mentioned a foreign policy issue yet, which probably says something about where those stand in the political debate. We'll get to, I'd like to hear your thoughts on those in a moment, but before we do, I'm going to ask Shir Efron to identify 2 or 3 issues that I see in the U.S.-Israel relationship that may have some broader political significance in the debate in the United States this year. One, which Israelis are talking about right now, which is about annexation in the West Bank. Two, about Israel's relationship with China, and perhaps Iran. So we'll take each of those in turn. Shira, could you just start by describing the status of the debate on annexation? Today's July 1st, which was possibly going to be a day that some decision would be made. It isn't being made, and when some of those key decisions might be made.
Sure. Just before that, I want to thank you for the opportunity to join this really distinguished group of leaders. And wherever you are, I hope you're healthy and safe. I think it's worth remembering that Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was extremely cautious and status quo on this issue of the Palestinians, began in April 2019 stating that he plans to annex all settlements in the West Bank. In September, he announced a plan to annex the Jordan Valley, and then the Trump plan, which was released in January, gave a green light to annexation of settlements spread through roughly 30% of the West Bank. And then the political engine accelerated. Under the Likud Blue-White coalition agreement, the Israeli government can proceed with formal deliberations on annexation beginning July 1, as Dan said, today. So we've been in this room for 20 minutes. Maybe we've missed something, but so far I haven't heard anything. Although there are apparently discussions at the Knesset today, and maybe they're still continuing now, discussing between the coalition partner on coming up with a joint statement. They are being challenged by opposition members from the right, Ayelet Shaked and Victor Lieberman. They both said today that Netanyahu caved into pressure from the Arabs and others. Foreign Minister Ashkenazi notably said today in response to a question by a journalist if there's going to be annexation today, and he said, I don't know, ask Netanyahu. So it means that even though we're sort of on this day, I can't tell you if annexation is going to happen, if yes, when, how extensive it will be, and what would be the reactions of the different stakeholders, the Palestinians, the regional countries, Europe, and of course different groups in the United States, and I'd love to hear your response to that. But we're getting indications only the mere threat of annexation is drawing a lot of pushback. What is interesting, there's a pushback obviously from different countries, but I think there's also pushback in the United States. There is a letter spearheaded by AOC, Alexandra Cortez, didn't draw many signatures, I think 13 members of the House, stated plans that threatens Israel with conditioning its military aid and using the A word, the apartheid, to describe Israel. We can dismiss this and say this is the more radical side of the Democratic Party, but this letter comes on the heels of a different letter that drew over 200 signatures, I think. 191, right, 191, with members that are all steadfast friends of Israel, Schakowsky, Deutsch, Price, and Schneider, and they're expressing concerns about unilateral annexation. You wanted to ask about Iran. It's interesting that you have members that signed this letter, those same members that opposed even the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran. We don't know how this annexation, if it happens, unfolds. There are many, many, many risks, and we can discuss them. One of the ones that sort of resonates most, I think, with a lot of Jewish groups in the United States is what it means for Israel character as a Jewish and democratic state.
Okay. Another issue, a foreign policy issue that does sometimes come up in the debates in the United States is about China. It's related to COVID, it's related to broader competition, but recently China has become an issue in the U.S.-Israel relationship as well. Can you briefly mention how that is the case and how that might tie into broader political concerns about China in the United States?
So, I think one of the only bipartisan issue in Washington now is the strategic competition, I should say, with China, which spans across multiple domains, the military, geopolitics, economics, and technology, obviously. And it's very clear that the United States, to rise up to the China challenge, it has to enlist the help of its friends and partners, and Israel is one of them. And it's akin to in the field of limiting Chinese investments and access to U.S. assets and knowledge and technology. If the U.S. tightens its screening mechanisms, but its friends continue business as usual with China, it's akin to closing the door but keeping the windows open. In that regard, it made a lot of press. Secretary Pompeo was here in May and delivered a message for Israel not to let a Chinese company build and operate what would be the biggest water desalination plant in the world. This tender, for another reason, didn't go to the Chinese company, but it does seem like pressure from really good friends of Israel on both sides of the house are going to continue. Israel, still scarred from the Pentagon and Harpy incidents of selling military defense equipment to China in the 90s and early 2000s, responds to U.S. pressure. It set up a committee for screening foreign investments. This committee seems to have limitations, which came to the public eye with this desal plant. My analysis is that we're going to see more of that.
Thank you. And lastly, as David Axelrod remember, in 2012, there was some question about whether Israel might attack Iran's nuclear facilities during the U.S. election, perhaps to put pressure on the Obama administration to support them or even join them. Of course, it didn't happen. But do you see anything similar in terms of Iran becoming a major issue during this election year?
It's more of a U.S. question, what happened in the U.S. when it comes to Iran. I think from the Israeli perspective, the official position is that the military option is still on the table. Brian Hook gave an exclusive interview yesterday in Jerusalem, where he also said that the military option is still on the table. I can see that happening in the next few months. I think everyone is very busy with COVID-19 and economic recession. Who knows? But of course, the issue is what's going to happen in the elections. It is my assessment that the Israeli government will try to lock any gains possible, especially if Biden wins the election. What we might see, and this would be interesting to see if Biden does win, which we heard here, between November and January, what Israel does. If a Biden administration really intends on restoring the JCPOA or trying to get to a new agreement with Iran, which formally, this is what they're promising to do at the moment, I think we will have some sort of a deja vu of the Israeli behavior. Prime Minister is probably going to go to Congress and appeal to allies, trying to hopefully prevent an agreement, and if this would be impossible, maybe shape the agreement.
Thank you. So now I want to turn back to David Axelrod and Tom Davis and ask both of you this question. If you have any thoughts about how any of these issues might resonate in American politics this year. More broadly, our Israeli audience would probably be interested in Israel's place in the U.S. election, whether even if it's not a top-tier issue, if it matters for specific constituencies, the Jewish community, the evangelical community in certain key swing states. How much does that matter to the overall outcome and to the strategies of the candidates? And maybe touch on the question of whether a perception anyway that the bipartisan consensus in American politics around Israel is eroding and how we might be seeing that manifested. So we'll start with you, David.
Well, let's start with annexation. One thing that you can assume is that Donald Trump will do what he thinks is in the interest of his reelection, and this is an issue. You saw Prime Minister Netanyahu make an appeal to American evangelicals the other day, and I think that was a sign of how he reads American politics. This is an issue that is important to American evangelicals and to some portion of the American Jewish community. I think the broader Jewish community would be very worried about such a move. And Dan, you and I have had this discussion. I think there's a real danger long term for Israel, because I see among younger people, and I work with them every day, a growing sense of outrage. AOC reflects it about the state of the Palestinians, about the treatment of the Palestinians, and a notion of perpetuating the current status and with no path forward, I think is a very, very negative one for the long-term relationships between Americans and Israel and young American Jews in Israel. But could it happen? Could in this election the president green light at least part of this annexation? I mean, he laid out the plan in January. I think if he thinks it will benefit his reelect, he will do that. I don't, there are 9 words, and I'm here as an analyst. I'm not here as a partisan, but I think this is probably a clinical observation. There are 9 words that are not going to pass from Donald Trump's mouth, which is, we could do that, but it would be wrong. That's not the way he thinks. He's going to say, will it advantage me? So that's on that issue. China obviously has become a big flare point. There is I think one of the assaults on Biden is going to be that Trump is tough on China, Biden is soft on China. They're going to try and hook Hunter Biden, Biden's son, up because he had some business dealings in China, and create a kind of nefarious picture. So China is going to be big here. The irony is, some of the things that we've done, withdrawing from the TPP and some other things, probably have long-term strategically for China been a great gift to them over the last 4 years. And on Iran, one of the things, when I said that Trump, that 4 months is an unpredictable amount of time, and that Trump is willing to do anything, again, if he thought a conflict was to his advantage or could change the conversation, that may affect his judgment on this. So I don't know. I'm not predicting that, but I think in his politics, everything is on the table. But I'm eager to hear what Tom's thoughts are on these.
Congressman Davis?
Yeah, generally foreign policy is not an issue in presidential elections until it is. And we've seen circumstances, the 1968 bombing halt in Hanoi, where LBJ used this to help Hubert Humphrey, and it closed the polls markedly then. The 1980, the Iran hostage crisis certainly damaged Jimmy Carter. There were other factors, economic and the others, that helped elect Ronald Reagan. But as a general rule, foreign policy is not part of this. But as David noted earlier, the president of the United States can control the agenda. And you have foreign states now that may start and flare, could flare things up in North Korea or Russia or China or the Middle East. The president has an opportunity, and the eyes of the nation are on to see how he responds. It gives him another chance to either show leadership or not. So I don't dismiss those. I don't miss those areas. Like David, I'm concerned about the bipartisan consensus that's developed around Israel for over the last decades. And I see basically a lot of these seats more in the Democratic Party as Muslims become a part of the coalition among younger voters who, when they look at social justice, are now looking at the Palestinians as the victims and not the Jewish state. And I think that's a longer term play that's going to play out within the Democratic coalition. But we've seen here in Northern Virginia a number of Muslim candidates coming up and block voting in these areas that I think over the long term, coalitionally, we'll see how they play out. But the bipartisan consensus, we're seeing just cracks in that at this point. It's not it's not huge, but I think long term, something that we need to watch. I think all the Russia and Ukraine talk from both parties is basically background noise. I'm not sure it moves anybody. It kind of helps the talking points. But China is a problem. I think Americans recognize this is a major problem because the COVID virus emanated from there. We'll see if it has any play. And at this point right now, foreign policy is not front stage in this campaign. But given where the president is, the levers that he can pull as commander-in-chief and picking fights and deciding where to go, it could become a polarizing factor and could become an issue as November emerges. David, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, one thing we should add, it's always hard to judge things in the moment. Right now, this story has emerged about Russia paying bounties for the killing of Americans by the Taliban in Afghanistan. It is an emerging story. The White House has not handled it well so far. The president says he didn't know anything about the intelligence. It was apparently in his briefing that he doesn't read. And I expect and you see a lot of Republicans now, because this is a flare point for Republican office holders, being very cautious and critical about this. So that is I put a pin in that one and see whether that emerges as a enduring issue in this campaign. But it's certainly hot at this moment.
And can I just throw in 10 seconds on the Jewish vote? Would that be all right?
Please.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, there's been some conversation about the impact of American Jewish voters on these presidential elections. There's this sense that the American Jewish vote is monolithic. It is not monolithic. It is a majority vote for Democrats. And I just want to very briefly share some data on where Jews have been in presidential elections. In 2000, 79% of American Jews voted for Gore. 2004, 76% for Kerry. 2008, 78% for President Obama. 2012, it went down to 69% of American Jews voting for Obama. And then in 2016, up to 71% of American Jews voting for Hillary Clinton. So it is a very important influence on elections, and I'm going to be very curious to see where this lands in 2020.
Steve, doesn't a lot of that break down about Orthodox versus Reform and conservative as well?
Orthodox Jewish voters tend to be more conservative, tend to vote in higher numbers for Republican candidates. That's true.
Shira, you have a brief observation on the bipartisan question about Israel?
Sure. So first, as a Jewish voter, I think probably domestic issues are going to play more than foreign policy issues. But I'm also worried about the long-term implications, and maybe as the only one on this panel that is a citizen of both countries, the U.S. and Israel, I'm extremely worried about the bipartisan nature of their relationship. We're definitely seeing this and working in the Jewish community and with the next generation of Jewish leaders, even though that are not alienated from Israel. The current three issues that I outlined, with mostly focus on the Palestinian issue, is pushing them away from Israel. So even if we're not going to see the effect now, we might see it down the line.
Great. All right, we have some excellent questions from the audience, which I'll now turn to, and I'm going to pitch these first to Congressman Davis and to David. You probably are expecting this one. Can you handicap Vice President Biden's choice for his running mate?
I'm a Republican. I'm the last person you want to ask on that. Right now, I think, I don't know why he did this. He said he was going to take a woman that just kind of limits the pool at this point. It's allowed major vetting. I don't know. I mean, Kamala Harris, I think, answers one thing, because you're going to get tremendous pressure from the African-American community now to pick an African-American after the George Floyd murder. And the like. His alternative basically is Elizabeth Warren, is the major non-minority woman that is out there, and she unites the progressives. So he's going to have to decide which way he goes. But I think those two would be the front runners.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of ways to look at this. I agree with Tom. There is an enormous amount of pressure, not just from the African-American community, but from younger voters to see an African-American candidate on the ballot. Kamala Harris, the conventional thinking is that Kamala Harris is the front runner for that position. There are other names that have surfaced, including your old colleague Susan Rice, Dan. Elizabeth Warren is the favorite of progressives. And is palpably someone, she ran a very strong campaign for president. She seems prepared. She's very strong on economic issues. I think that one of the things that I'd be concerned about if I were Biden is, Trump is desperately looking for a way, as I said, to scare voters he needs to scare back into his column. And I think since Biden isn't scary, you could see him turn to an argument that, he's a Trojan horse. She's really going to be the president. This was the play, and then run against her. So her strength is also a weakness. Nonetheless, she would be a strong candidate. And then there's the theory: should he just double down and pick a governor, pick someone who is essentially not a big target, but palpably ready to take over. So my sense is that he hasn't arrived at a decision yet. And he announced yesterday that it won't be until early August that he announces it. So he's got 4 or 5 weeks to mull this over, and they're deep into vetting now. So the honest answer is I'm not giving any odds on anything.
I think that's a wise counsel. Next question. You both spoke about the kind of volatility, and so did Congressman Israel, about the volatility, uncertainty that we're in. And it really raises the question in the minds of some observers, probably at home, certainly from outside the United States. Is it possible we could end up with a disputed outcome? Is it possible we could end up with an election that, first of all, we don't know who the winner is on November 3rd. Second of all, there's a real dispute about who has actually won. And third of all, could it even affect whether we have a proper, peaceful, orderly transition next January 20th?
One of the go ahead, Tom. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, in 2000 we had a disputed election, and it came down to a 5-4 vote in the Supreme Court, basically. And life went on the next day. There were no protests in the street. The country accepted it. If we were to face something like that again, I don't think it would be. I don't think you would see the same tranquility. I think it would be very, very divisive at this point, given the amount of mail-in ballots we're going to have and the length of time it's taking to count them. If this comes down to a close race, it could get ugly pretty quickly. But again, I think the idea that Trump wants to stay in the White House and will use the army, I think this stuff is way out of proportion at this point. But the country is much more divided than it was 20 years ago when we had a contested election. It was decided by the Supreme Court. And I think it would be a concern to all of us. David?
Yeah, I agree with this. Look, the COVID-19 has had so many impacts on us, but one of them is it's going to impact on voting. The fact is that people are, particularly older people, are concerned about going out, and so there is this push for mail-in voting, and the president has taken a very strong position against mail-in voting, suggesting that it is a font of fraud that there's no real empirical evidence to support that. But it does set him up, if he loses, to say, there was massive fraud. And, I don't think the danger, Tom, is that he's not going to leave the White House. I think that Donald Trump is, but I also don't think that there's never going to be a moment where he steps out, as Al Gore did in 2000, and say, the people have spoken and the system must be served. He is going to take his defeat. He believes there are two outcomes: either he wins or it's stolen, and he will take his defeat and he will move on and lead a resistance movement, probably through a media outlet, and that will be the springboard for it. And the collateral damage will be to our democracy, because it is for America or any democracy to have the integrity of an election questioned by large numbers of people is a disastrous outcome. So, even 2000, with all the comedy with which Gore finally accepted defeat after the decision of the Supreme Court, I think there were some lasting impacts of it. I think it did have an impact on our politics. This could be much worse, and that is as much my concern as anything. How we come out of this election, because our institutions have been badly shaken, and if you don't have strong institutions in which people believe in a democracy, that is a fundamental problem.
David, just one of the things we're finding, we're not used to counting absentees by mail in mass amounts, except for a handful of states that do this on a regular basis. And
yes,
this could stretch those outcomes for weeks. And even if it's decisive at the end, it can add to a narrative about it being stolen and the like, create ill will, make it harder for whoever wins to come in and unite the country.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a big concern.
Next question has to do with David, our former boss, President Obama, but also other former presidents, President George W. Bush. What roles do you expect to see them play? Do you expect us to hear more from them during the course of this campaign?
Well, let me speak to Obama. and Tom can speak to Bush. Obviously, President Obama has been more prominent and outspoken these last few years, and he's already made a couple of an opening endorsement of Biden, and he just did a large event for Biden online. And I expect he was very aggressive in 2018 on behalf of Democratic candidates. I think he'll be out there campaigning hard for him. He obviously has a close relationship with Biden, can provide testimonials that no one else can provide. He has a perspective on him that nobody else can give. And in an environment in which Trump is going to try and make the case that Biden is ill-equipped for the job, unfit for the job, I think Obama will be a valuable counterpoint.
I agree with David, and I think on the Bush part, Trump ended up winning the Republican nomination in large part because he was the anti-Bush. He went after the Bush administration. He ran and beat the president's brother. I think there is some ill will, but George W. Bush, whatever you think of his presidency, is a class act after he left. I think he'll just stay out of it, and I don't think you'll see him involved at all. You've had a number of high-profile Bush appointees have come out against Trump at this point. Trump was a disruptor. Some would say it was a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, although the party was already moving in the direction that Trump understood as a Republican base migrated from the country club to the country. But I think Bush will stay out of it. And I think you'll see some of his leading administration figures be out there for Biden. And we've already seen some of that.
You know, let me just say, if I could, Dan, one word on this. When we were quite critical of President Bush during our campaign, although the president and Senator Obama worked closely together on the TARP legislation after the collapse of Lehman Brothers on Wall Street, but in the transition, President Bush and everyone who worked for him could not have been more helpful and supportive to us in that transition, not because he loved what Obama said during the campaign, not because he agreed with him on everything, but because he believed strongly in the institutions of our democracy. And I just have to believe that President Bush, it's one thing to be disruptive in terms of policy. It's another thing to be disruptive in terms of stirring up enmity toward to the rule of law and the military and the intelligence community. And I have to believe that's deeply disturbing to President Bush, whether he articulates it or not. I think you can pretty much assume that is the case.
We used to call that the golden silence in Virginia when Byrd would not endorse the Democrat. That was enough to give people permission to go the other way.
I recall the transition in the other direction was a bit chaotic, not because the Obama administration was not prepared to try to be as helpful as the Bush administration had been, but because the incoming Trump administration was really not very well organized and maybe not so open to receiving that help. It's a very interesting question, which I suspect the Biden team is thinking about. Might they have to face a very chaotic and maybe even a hostile environment for a transition going in the other direction? Last question before we'll allow the director of INSS to offer some closing words, and that is whether or not there's any chance that President Trump might shake up his own ticket and replace Vice President Pence as his running mate to create some excitement or change the narrative around his campaign.
Yeah, I mean,
Tom, I'm interested in your view on that.
I think anything is possible at this point. And you have out there some very attractive ethnic. You've got a Nikki Haley. You've got folks out there that whether they would take it or not is a different deal. But I think he is focused on re-election. I think he will do whatever. I think Vice President Pence has shown a strong loyalty to the president. But I think we have seen sometimes that's not always returned in kind. And I think primarily they're going to take a look at what works best. I doubt he'll make a replacement, but I think anything is possible in this environment when you're down in the polls the way he is.
I'd say two things about this. One is Pence does have a loyal constituency among evangelical voters, and that's something that Trump would have to consider. But more than that, the idea that replacing a vice president is going to solve Trump's problems are ludicrous to me, because the issue is Trump. Very rarely do vice presidents honestly make a big difference in an election. Right now, the election is, do you want 4 more years of Donald Trump? And I'm not sure that even a change of vice presidents is going to would alter people's thinking on that. And yes, Nikki Haley would, as a woman of color, as a younger candidate, as you know, there are a lot of things about her that might appeal, but she's not going to be the candidate. Trump's going to be the candidate, and I don't think this would make an enormous difference, or even a measurable difference for him in his reelect.
Well,
That
David,
said, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say it helps him if he wants to change the narrative. The American public's memories are sometimes short, and this could help him. Now, Pence would have to agree to go quietly, as you will, maybe take the next appointment at the Supreme Court, whatever. But I think that as you look at this, anything is possible. And if he has to change the narrative, this is a guy who's willing to do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure Pence is a lawyer. Is he a lawyer?
He is a lawyer.
Okay. I agree with you. The loyalty is not going to bind Trump to Pence. If he thinks Pence is a liability and he can improve his chances, he will jettison him. And the way he could do it would be to say, he was in charge of the COVID-19 process, and that would be the backstory that would be let out, that he was unhappy with the handling of it.
Well, I want to offer my thanks to Congressman Davis, to David Axelrod, to Shira Efron, and of course to Steve Israel for being partners in this joint INSS Cornell University webinar. I hope we'll have other opportunities. I'm going to turn it over to the Director of INSS, General Amos Yadlin, for some closing words. And then Steve, I think we'll let you have the final word after General Yadlin speaks.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. In the 1960s, the Prime Minister of Israel, Levi Eshkol, was said that there is a drought. And he asked, is this in our Negev? They say, no, it's in Kansas. Okay, so this is a real concern. America and Israel are well connected. And here in Israel, we take great interest in the election in the United States, because first of all, we respect the largest democratic country and your democratic process, and you are our greatest ally. So two good reasons to interest in this election, and this year election are even more interesting. We are very appreciate the opportunity to partner with Cornell University Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, and my old friend, Congressman Steve Israel, and David Axelrod, and Tom Davis, all of them expert in the American political process. So we all know now that it's the economy stupid again. And the economy is because of the coronavirus. Here in Israel and in the United States, we had this black swan of the pandemic, the COVID-19, that have done first the health crisis and then the economic crisis. And if you add on this the social unrest and the racial protest against what happened to George Floyd, it's a huge effect on the election. And we know from our small perspective that Israel is not an issue. You already said that foreign affairs is not an issue, but even though we are not interested, you may not interested in Israel, Israel is very much interested in you. And Shira covered the three issues that are on the top of Israel national security today. We just wrote in the INSS policy papers, policy recommendations to the new emergency unity government. And the three issues are exactly what Dan and Shira brought to this panel. It's Iran, it's China, and it's the applying the Israeli law or the annexation that, as Dan said, today the process should start. Sometimes processes start and finish in the same day. It is not the case here, and this is due to the United States, because there was only one article in the coalition agreement that blue and white, General Gantz, didn't have veto, and this was the annexation issue. But they were smart enough to put in the wording that it will be done only if the US will agree for that. And the US is asking now that any annexation will be according to Israeli consensus. So they gave back the veto that blue and white put in the agreement to the hands of General Gantz. And as he is now called the alternate prime minister. Yeah. And he says that coronavirus crisis and the economic crisis is more important than the annexation, and annexation can wait. We are very much interested at the position and the attitudes and the policy of the two candidates on these issues. We don't see, in the past, let's put it this way, in the past, Israel was a bipartisan issue in America. Unfortunately, not anymore. And there are differences. The big difference is on annexation. I agree fully that Trump will decide according to his re-election consideration. Secretary of State Pompeo saying what Israel will decide we support, but I think the final word is in the White House. And I'm well aware that the Democrats and Biden are against annexation. On China, I think it's different, because if there is a bipartisan issue today in America, it's that China become a real threat to America. And from a great power competition, you are going to a real Cold War, and maybe more than that. So on this, I see no difference between Democrats and Republicans. And on Iran, there is a difference. It's not that big as on annexation, because there is a consensus in America that Iran should not have a nuclear weapons. However, how to achieve it, totally different policies. So we will look very carefully about where the policies are going in the two candidates' camps. The convention are ahead of us. Platforms, as much as they are important, but we will look very carefully at it. We also look very carefully at what is happening to the American democracy, because American democracy was something as a model to the rest of the world who care about democracy. The fact that you have election every 4 years, you have a very strong constitution, and for the first time there are question marks on the American process, how stable it is, will it survive the fake news era, the intervention from the outside, the health crisis, the lockout, voting in mail, whatever. So it's a new phenomena that we have to watch very carefully, because in our democracy we also go to abnormal processes, 3 elections in a row, and who knows when the 4th will come. So I think this is a common challenge for Israel and America, to prove to ourselves and to the rest of the world that democracy is still the best system to cope with humanity challenges, crises, And you know, if you are in China today, they are arguing, look at the results, look at the bottom line. We have handled it much better than the democracy because we are not a democracy. So it's very, very important. Israel and America are long years and allies, close allies, based on values, common interest, and the fact that we know each other, we trust each other in the levels, in all the levels that I saw, the defense level, the military level, the political level. I must say that in the last couple of years, we have some cracks in this very strong common values and common interest and the trust between leaders and people. It is my hope that the election in your country, as well as the development in this country, will lead to strengthen our relation, to have again 100% overlap in values, whatever needed in interest, and a lot of trust. So we will continue with these sessions, and we see how things will develop. Thank you, Dan, for leading it from our side. Thank you very much for participating and bringing your view, Shira. And of course, on the other side, in Cornell, I have learned a lot. Thank you very much.
So much to everybody. General, thank you for your leadership. Ambassador Shira, thank you. Congressman Davis, David Axelrod, thank you. This is the first in a series of presentations on the impact of the U.S. Elections on Israel and U.S.-Israeli relations. We'd hoped to present it live in Tel Aviv. Circumstances didn't allow it, but I believe that the past hour and 5 minutes has provided as much insight as you can get. I hope INSS will partner with us on future sessions, and we wish everybody well and good health. Thank you all again.